All right, this is for sketching the graph of an exponential function basic. They're going to ask you to graph an exponential function like g of x equals 2/3 raised to the x power. They're even going to tell you what values to use for your x values and to plot in your graph. They remind you to draw all asymptotes and then click on the graph icon, okay, which is this right here. So we're going to be using a lot of these tools here. So the first thing I want to do is remind you that when you have g of x equals 2/3 raised to the x power, the g of x is the same thing as y, okay? So when we're looking at, before I get started on this actual example, I want you to think about what's going to happen here. So let's look at a couple of more simple problems, ones that don't have fraction. Well, this one doesn't have fraction. This one will be an easier fraction to deal with. And let's just see how these two are related to each other, okay? So when you have y equals 2 to the x power, you're going to plug in these values for x and solve your equation for y. So for this x value of a -2, that gives us y equals 2 to the -2nd power. Now remember what that's going to give us. That means we're going to take, we've got to deal with that negative first. So this becomes 1 over 2 squared. So we move the 2 into the denominator, and now the exponent is no longer negative. And now we square that. That gives us 1 to the 4th. Okay, so that's our y value. Now remember, if I, anyway, let's keep going here, and then we'll talk about what's happening here. So let's keep plugging in now. We're going to replace the x with a -1, so we write that as 1 over 2 to the 1st power, which is just 1/2. Okay, now replace the x with 0. We get 2 to the 0. Remember that any number raised to the 0 power is 1. Now we replace the x with a +1. We get 2 to the 1st, which is just 2. We do the same thing here. Y equals 2, replace x with the 2, and we get 4. Okay, so now I'm just going to show you what's going to happen over here on this graph. Now, if I'm plugging in a -2 1/4, I'm going to use this button here that shows to graph it at an exact point. I'm going to put x as a -2. My y value is going to be 1/4. And I just tell it to plot that point for me. So you need to do that anytime you have a value that's not a whole number in your ordered pair. Okay, now I'm going to do the same thing for a -1 and 1/2 for my y value, and 0, 1, so I can plot that point if I'd like, 1, 2, and 2, 4. Now, if I hit this button here, it says I need to draw 5 points and 1 asymptote, so it's reminding me to do that. So that was awfully nice. And so I need to draw the asymptote. So what I want you to see here is even when my x values were negative, my y value is never going to be negative. Okay? And when x is positive, I'm still never going to have a negative value. So it's, and I want you to think about, can it ever, so we know it's not going to be down here. We're not going to have any values down here below the x-axis. What about 0? Can 2 raised to some power ever equal 0? So if I take a number and I raise it to some power, can it ever equal 0? And the answer is no. I want you to think about that. Okay? And so that's where my asymptote is going to be. So we're going to click on this horizontal asymptote, and we're going to place that right here on the x-axis. Whoops, that did not happen where I wanted it to, so I'm going to say undo. Click on that again, see if I can get it right, and click there. Okay, and that's where I want this asymptote. Now I want to graph those points. Now it makes the graph that I want. Okay? Now what I want you to realize here is if I was graphing y equals 1/2 x, my graph is going to be, my points are going to be pretty similar. So I want you to think about this. Now, if I had, if I replace x here with the negative 2 and I have 1/2, I'm going to have to just do this 1/2 to the negative 2 power. Should have given myself a little more room. Remember what's going to happen is, to get rid of the negative exponent, I'm going to flip that and make that a positive exponent. So I'm going to, 1/2 becomes 2/1, which is just 2. 2 to the second is 4. Okay? If I do the same thing with, this is 1/2 to the negative first power, it's essentially just going to flip everything over. That gives me 2/1, which is just 2. 1/2 to the 0 power is 1. And if I have 1/2 to the first power, that gives me 1/2. And 1/2 to the second power, 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4, that gives me 1/4. And if you notice, this gives me the same points, but in the reverse order. So this one would actually come down from the left and go down towards the asymptote on the right. Okay, so very similar. Okay, so what's going to happen is, let's go back to the problem, the original problem that we were given. I'll go ahead and clear all this. And if I have a negative 2 here, I'm just going to replace my x value with a negative 2 and solve that for y. So this is going to become 3/2. I'm going to take its reciprocal to the positive 2. That gets rid of the negative for me. So then 3 squared is 9 and 2 squared is 4. So this gives me a 9/4. And I do the same thing with a negative 1, 2/3 to the negative first power. And that's going to, I take its reciprocal, 3/2 to the first power, which is 3/2. Okay, and so we know what's going to happen here. Hopefully you're recognizing the pattern. When we raise something to the 0 power, that's going to give me 1. And then y equals 2/3 to the first power is just 2/3. And then y equals 2/3 to the second power. 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, that gives me 4/9. Seeing a pattern here too? Okay, that's going to help you when you're graphing. And also remember, hey, the asymptote's going to be the same thing. It's never going to equal 0, so I have an asymptote right along the x-axis. Okay, and then I'm going to need to plot some points. And I'm going to use this exact, this tool that allows me to plot those negatives, those fractions, excuse me. So negative 2, and then my y value is 9/4. I plot that point, and then I'm going to plot negative 1 with 3/2. And 0, 1. And then I'm going to go back to that tool and plot 1 and 2/3. And then 2 and 4/9. Use my tool, and there's my graph.